everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today I'm very excited to do a kind of a pad preview, I guess you can say, of the WaycoIsland Project 87 that WaycoIsland was kind enough to send over for review early, so thank you very much to them. Now this is a prototype of their upcoming hybrid control pad, I guess you could say. According to WaycoIsland, this pad is a hybrid pad with a heavy emphasis on control, which is fairly accurate to how this pad is going to be performing. It actually has a very familiar surface stitch to another hybrid pad that also had a lot of control to it, but I'll talk about that a little later in this video, of course. Now, this is a prototype version of the Project 87. The final retail version is going to have a couple changes to it, so today's not going to be necessarily a review, it's more of like a preview video, but WaycoIsland has done some really unique things with this pad, and I definitely think this is a pad you should be keeping your eye on, because when it does release, I have a feeling it's going to be a big hit, because it is a very unique pad. But before we get into it, thank you very much again to WaycoIsland for sending over the P87 pad early for me to preview. I greatly appreciate it. As always, regardless of a free, discounted unit, or affiliation with a brand, reviews here on the channel are always going to be unbiased, and as always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. But with that all out of the way, let's go ahead and get into our preview of the WaycoIsland Project 87. Now, in terms of testing parameters, I tested the Project 87 with the Axer pad Obsidian Air dots and the Jade dots. I tested the pad around the 40 to 60 centimeter range, and I tested the pad for about 2.5 weeks, using it both for work and gaming, daily driving the pad for the entire time. In terms of the P87's in-game performance, overall the pad was very interesting. The pad, as I mentioned earlier, is advertised as being a hybrid pad with a heavy emphasis on control, and as we'll talk about later in this video, the hybrid nature of this pad is accurate, but the performance feels much more akin to a balanced control pad, similar to what you'd see on like the X-Ray pad Origins Pro Cerberus. Due to its hybrid nature, the Project 87 pad performs extremely well across all game types. Dynamic aiming performance is stellar, consistent on both the X and Y axis, but much slower than you see on a traditional hybrid pad. Static aiming performance is also incredibly consistent here on the P87. The controlled nature of the P87 combined with its balanced X and Y axis is the perfect landscape for very solid static performance. Overall, the P87 performed very well, but in my opinion, it's not a hybrid pad. Sure, the surface stitching is hybrid pad-like, but the control from the Project 87 surface makes the pad feel much more like a balanced control pad than a hybrid pad with a heavy emphasis on control. Again, very similar to what you'd see on a balanced pad like the X-Ray pad Cerberus. Alright, let's talk about the surfacing here on the Project 87 next. To the hand, the Project 87 surfacing is semi-smooth with a tiny bit of abrasiveness to it. The P87 is a non-treated surface, so there is going to be no work-in period with this pad. Under the microscope, you can see that the pad surfacing is very hybrid-like in its design. We've actually seen the surface stitching very similar to this before in the form of the Razor Strider. Comparing the P87 and the Strider side by side, you can see just how similar the surface stitching is. The only difference between the two is that the P87 surface is softer and thinner threading, whereas the Strider surfacing was that tougher, wider stitch. The unique surface stitch is what gives the P87 its hybrid-like performance and its balanced X and Y axis, while the thinner and more softer threading gives the P87 its heavy controlled feeling. In terms of static friction here on the P87, for my testing, the pad has a fairly low static friction. There is no noticeable startup period when I go to move my mouse across the P87 surface. Dynamic friction on the pad is smooth and consistent. The balanced X and Y axis keeps movements linear and without any variance, but the dynamic friction is where you feel the most of the control of the Project 87. Stopping power here on the P87 is similar to static friction. It is low, but there is enough where you still can stop easily without sliding too much on the pad surface. The static dynamic friction and stopping power can be altered by the control variability here on the P87, but I'll talk about that more later on in this video. Keep in mind that I was using dot skates for my testing on the P87, so my experience will vary here from the experience with other skate types. Now, WaycoIsland has confirmed that the final version of the Project 87 pad will have the exact same Strider-like surface stitching, so you're going to get pretty much the exact same similar performance where it's a hybrid-like stitch, but it's going to have a heavy emphasis on control, bringing the pad to feel more like a balanced control pad. The exact same surfacing is going to be on the final version of the Project 87, so while I don't have the final version here today, with the experience on the in-game performance and how it feels to the hand is going to be the exact same on the final version. Alright, let's talk about the Project 87's softness next. As I mentioned earlier, I have a prototype version of this pad, which is around a mid-soft feeling pad. The final retail version of the Project 87 is going to be thicker, coming in at 4.5 millimeters, which will make the final retail version of the P87 much more of a soft pad. The final version of the Project 87 will of course have a much higher degree of control availability than the prototype and will have a differencing in skate compatibility, but I will talk about that later in this video. Alrighty, let's talk about skate compatibility next. On the Project 87 prototype, I was able to use all skate types without issue. Dots, donuts, speed stocks, and full-size stock skates worked completely fine. But as I just mentioned, the final retail version of the Product 87 is going to be thicker and softer, so skate compatibility will likely be affected. My assumptions based on my experience with other 4.5mm pads is that dot skates won't be usable, speed stocks might not work, but it will depend on the thickness. Donuts and full-size stocks will be perfectly compatible with the final version. But I will say though, there is going to be a big difference with the Product 87's feeling depending on the skate material. I was initially using the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air skates, which are skates I've used on other hybrid pads before, but due to the Product 87's controlled surface, the skates were very slow, almost a little too slow for my taste. I found that the speed optimized X-Ray Pad Jade skates worked much better here on the Product 87 and complemented its performance profile the best. Of course, this will vary from person to person, but from my testing, speed optimized skates like the X-Ray Pad Jade skates were the most compatible with the overall performance profile and the surfacing here on the Project 87. Let's talk about control variability next. As I mentioned earlier, the Project 87 is a mid to soft prototype. The final retail version is going to be thicker and softer, so the control variability will feel different on that pad. As such, the range of control variability is going to be much wider on the final version of the Product 87 than it is here on the prototype version of the Product 87. I assume the control variability will be similar to what we've seen on pads like the Raven Mori V2, as they are the same 4.5mm thickness, but the higher range of control variability on the final retail version will of course impact skate compatibility, as I just mentioned. I do think the final retail version having a softer base will definitely better suit the performance profile here in the Project 87, as it will change the pad more from a hybrid pad with a heavy emphasis on control to more of a balanced control pad, which better complements the actual performance of the Project 87. Alrighty, let's talk about the base here in the Project 87 next. WaycoIsland is using a full polyurethane base here on the P87, and its implementation is actually quite good. The base has a great natural stickiness to it that with a little added force anchors itself to desktops extremely well. The overall performance of the P87's base is fantastic. The only issue I have with the base is that since this is a prototype, there are some creases and wrinkles in the base, but these are purely cosmetic and aren't going to affect the performance of the pad at all. The other issue, of course, is that due to its natural stickiness, it does pick up pet fur and dust and dirt very easily, but this is very common for very sticky bases like this. Overall, a very solid base implementation, and I'm happy to say that WaycoIsland has confirmed that the base that is here on the prototype version of the Project 87 will be the same one on the final retail version, just with some cosmetic fixes, of course. So the same great base performance we see here on the prototype Project 87 will be on the final retail version, which in my opinion is a great thing to see. The base implementation is very good. Now, one interesting aspect of the Project 87 is how it handles moisture. Whenever moisture is applied to the surface of the pad, it beads on the surface for just a moment and then quickly drains into the pad. The only pad I've seen handle water this well was the Zowie GSR2. Now, moisture does slightly affect the surface of the pad as the surface threading does get waterlogged, but this is way more moisture than the pad will ever be exposed to, even during normal use in a high humidity environment. So the Project 87 is going to be widely unaffected by moisture, which is a great attention to detail. Honestly, I have to give props to WaycoIsland here. Matching the moisture absorption of the GSR2 is incredibly impressive, so props to them. Alright, and lastly, in terms of arm sleeve and bare arm usage, the prototype of the Project 87 is usable with both bare arms and arm sleeves. Personally speaking, I found bare arm to be the easiest, as arm sleeves have a tiny little bit of extra friction, but nothing I was significantly impacting the performance. I just preferred bare arm for my testing. Since the retail Project 87 will be using the same surfacing, I assume the usage for bare arms and arm sleeves will be exactly the same on the retail version. There may be some slight differences in the friction due to the extra thickness, but usage will likely be pretty similar to what we see here on the prototype version of the Project 87 to the final retail edition of the Project 87. Alright, well, in closing, overall the P87 is quite an interesting pad. For this being a prototype pad, I'm actually quite impressed with it overall, specifically with its very unique performance profile and moisture absorption ability that is matching the GSR2, which is very impressive. I do think that WaycoIsland is doing the right thing by making the final retail version of the P87 thicker than the prototype, the final retail version coming in at 4.5mm, while using the same surfacing and base. In its current thickness, the P87 feels like a hybrid pad with a heavy emphasis of control, which does fight against the hybrid nature of this pad to a degree. By making the pad thicker and increasing the control variability while keeping the pad surfacing the same will make the P87 feel much more like a balanced control pad, similar to the performance profiles we saw in the X-Ray Pad Origins Pro Cerberus, which I think is a good thing and much better suits the overall feeling of the P87. But overall, I'm quite impressed with what WaycoIsland has been cooking up. Even with this prototype pad, despite its odd performance profile, it is still one of the better pads I've tried this year, and I'm very excited to see what the final retail version of the P87 will end up performing like, and of course I'm interested to see what else WaycoIsland is cooking up, but that's going to be a video for another time. I will do my best to make another video covering the final retail version of the P87 closer to its release, so if you like what you're seeing here with the prototype of the Project 87, you want to see what the final version ends up being like, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the update video that I will hopefully have coming out later this year. But that's all for today. Thank you very much again to WaycoIsland for sending over the P87 prototype for me to take a look at. This pad's been a really fun one to test out, and I'm very, very excited to see what else they're cooking up and what the final P87 ends up looking like. Big shout out to our channel members Yuki89 and Prince. Thank you very much for your support. If you'd like to become a member and support the channel, you can do so. It's only $2 per month, and that is the best way to directly support the channel. You can also use code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Mech Keys, Potent Gaming, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money on your orders and help directly support the channel. Thank you very much again for watching my little preview of the WaycoIsland Project 87, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.